You may be getting the sense that these videos are a little bit Ephraim-centric, but that's not because the value of the other tribes and their contributions are any less, but because it has been the primary focus in my studies regarding the tribes, as Ephraim does have a prophetic calling as leaders in the building up of Zion in these last days. And because I am a Levite among Ephraim, having also the blood of Ephraim in my lineage, therefore being a Levite among Ephraim, I'm called to teach that to that tribe. And so that's been a heavy focus. We will be touching on some of the other tribes as we go along, and there have been some things that have been revealed to me, although some of the tribes, I will be quite honest, I have had very little revealed to me at this point, and that may change in the future. Certainly, I do not wish to give anyone the impression that I want to diminish the role of Judah, for it is also a leadership tribe and very important in all the prophecies, incredibly important. And as God said through Jacob when he blessed Judah, that the scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the lawgiver from between his feet, until Shiloh come. Until Shiloh come. And in that is a great mystery, and we'll get into that later. But for now, let us turn to one of the most important events in biblical history in terms of understanding the prophets and how to apply their latter-day prophecies regarding Israel. That event, the time of the dividing of the nation of Israel, north and south, if you can understand the implications of that, which is plainly taught in the Bible, but essentially completely ignored by every Bible scholar and those who love to tell you how current events in the news are a fulfillment of the scriptures, you will discover, if you can understand the implications of the divided nation, that you can have more understanding of the prophets and the modern implications of their prophecies than the experts that you watch on TV or see on YouTube or show up as guests in Christian networks or read from books. So let's get into it, shall we?
As discussed in previous chapters, until the time of David, the center of worship and the resting place of the tabernacle of God and the Ark of the Covenant was in Shiloh, a city in the hill country of Ephraim's territory. This was because, previous to David, the tribe of Ephraim had always been the head of the tribes of Israel. Prior to David, the tradition that the firstborn would receive the blessing of the firstborn had repeatedly been broken. Isaac received the blessing over Ishmael. Jacob had obtained it over Esau. And Joseph had received the blessing of the firstborn over Reuben and 9 other brothers who came before him. The truth of this was prophetically revealed in the dream that God gave Joseph, which showed his brothers bowing before him, which also spoke to what would literally happen in Egypt many years from then. Israel eventually blessed Joseph, and with the passage of time, he also blessed Joseph's 2 sons, and Ephraim likewise received the blessing of the firstborn instead of his older brother Manasseh. Additionally, in the blessing, Israel placed his own name, that of Israel, upon them both. And Jacob said unto Joseph, God Almighty appeared unto me at Luz in the land of Canaan, and blessed me, and said unto me, Behold, I will make thee fruitful, and multiply thee, saith the Lord, and I will make of thee a multitude of people, and will give this land to thy seed after thee, for an everlasting possession. And now of thy 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, which were born unto thee in the land of Egypt, before I came unto thee in Egypt, behold, they are mine, and the God of my fathers shall bless them, even as Reuben and Simeon, they shall be blessed, for they are mine, wherefore they shall be called after my name. Therefore they were called Israel. Genesis chapter 48, verses 3 through 5, inspired version. From the lineage of Ephraim came many of Israel's great leaders, beginning with Moses. Although it is certain that both Moses and his brother Aaron were of the tribe of Levi, it seems, though, that they were also descendants of Joseph and Ephraim through intertribal marriage. The Lord revealed this through the prophet Joseph Smith, Jr., when he received by the gift of God, through the Urim and Thummim, additions to the story found in the book of Genesis. The inspired version of the Bible records that Joseph, the son of Israel, prophesied just before his death that the nation of Israel would become enslaved to Egypt. He also foretold that one of his own descendants would deliver Israel from that bondage. The God of my father Jacob be with you, to deliver you out of affliction in the days of your bondage. For the Lord has visited me, and I have obtained a promise of the Lord, that out of the fruit of my loins the Lord God will raise up a righteous branch out of my loins, and unto thee, whom my father Jacob hath named Israel, a prophet, not the Messiah, who is called Shiloh. And this prophet shall deliver my people out of Egypt in the days of thy bondage. Genesis chapter 50, verse 24, inspired version. It was a Hebrew tradition that only a descendant of the deceased would carry with him the bones of that ancestor. Moses is recorded in all versions of the Bible as having retrieved the bones of Joseph and taking responsibility for carrying them out of Egypt. And Moses took the bones of Joseph with him, for he had straitly sworn to the children of Israel, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones away hence with you. Exodus chapter 13, verse 19, King James Bible. For this reason, some scholars have speculated that Moses was not only of the tribe of Levi, but also partly descended from Joseph. And then we have Joshua, one of the greatest biblical heroes. Joshua, whom the name Jesus is derived from, was also from the tribe of Ephraim. He was one of only 2 spies who brought back a good report from the land of Canaan. And he later led Israel in the conquest of the Promised Land and was an instrument in God's hand to distribute land for tribal inheritances. And then we come to Samuel. Another great figure in Ephraimite history was Samuel the prophet, who was raised in Shiloh by Eli the high priest. Samuel is viewed by rabbinical literature as the last of the Hebrew judges and the first of the major prophets who began to prophesy in the land of Israel. God used him to select and anoint the first 2 kings of the kingdom of Israel, King Saul and King David. It is also interesting to note that God appointed an Ephraimite prophet to oversee the transition of rule from the tribe of Ephraim to the tribe of Judah. However, this rule lasted only 2 generations under David and Solomon. It was lost as soon as Rehoboam, Solomon's son, took the throne. Even during the time when Israel was ruled from Jerusalem, the coronation ceremony for a new king would continue to be held at Shechem in Ephraim's territory. After the conquest of the Promised Land, the boundaries of the land assigned to the tribe of Ephraim were made specific as found in Joshua chapter 16, verses 1 through 10. It included most of what was afterwards called Samaria. It lay in the center of all traffic from north to south and from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. This area was about 55 miles long and 30 miles wide. For more than 500 years, Ephraim, with its 2 closely connected tribes of Manasseh and Benjamin, worked with the Levites and exercised undisputed preeminence among all the tribes of Israel. Joshua, the first conqueror, Gideon, the greatest of the judges, and Saul, the first king, all belonged to one of these 3 tribes. As previously mentioned, the Ark of the Covenant and the Tabernacle of God were originally set up in Shiloh, a city in Ephraim's territory. They remained there for 400 years until the time of Eli, the high priest. Shiloh, not Jerusalem, remained the center of worship for the nation of Israel. But after suffering a defeat at the hands of the Philistines, Eli's son removed the ark from Shiloh and took it into battle against the Philistines at Ebenezer in hopes of winning there. That did not happen. Israel was routed, Eli's sons were killed, and the ark was captured by the Philistines. Back in Shiloh, Eli, the high priest, immediately died upon hearing the news. The ark eventually returned to Israel due to the curse it brought upon the Philistines, but it was not returned to Shiloh. Instead, the ark was set in the field of Joshua the Bethshemite. After 70 of their men were smitten for gazing at the ark, the men of Bethshemesh had the ark removed to Kirjath Jearim, or Baal Judah, and the house of Abinadab, whose son Eleazar was sanctified to keep it. Kirjath Jearim thus became the resting place of the ark for a period of 20 years. At the very beginning of his reign, David took the ark from Kirjath Jearim with the intent of moving it to Jerusalem. However, on the way to Jerusalem, Uzzah, one of the drivers of the cart by which the ark was carried, put out his hand to steady the ark and died. David, in fear, carried the ark into the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite, where it stayed for 3 months. But upon hearing that the Lord had blessed Obed-Edom because of the presence of the ark in his house, David then had the ark brought to Jerusalem by the Levites, while he, girded with a linen ephod, danced before the Lord with all his might. David then put the ark in the tabernacle that he had prepared for it, and Levites were then appointed to carry out their duties before the ark. David had planned to build a permanent temple for the ark, but this plan was stopped through God's instructions to the prophet. From the settlement of Canaan until the time of David and Solomon, Ephraim had held the place of honor among all the tribes. It occupied the most desirable and central portions of the land of Israel. And it is interesting to note that Eli's daughter-in-law, who bore a son at the time of the news of the capture of the ark, named him Ichabod, which means the glory has departed. And so the glory had departed. When the ark was removed from Shiloh and subsequently brought to Jerusalem, the power of Ephraim was humbled, for the glory of God departed from Shiloh and moved to Jerusalem. At this time, God favored David of the tribe of Judah. Though we have seen in our previous videos, there is compelling evidence to show that David's lineage included some descendants from the tribe of Ephraim as well. Nevertheless, David was counted as being of the tribe of Judah, and after David became king, he waged several successful military campaigns, annexing Philistia, Edom, Moab, Ammon, and parts of ancient Syria known as Aram Zobah and Aram Damascus. Under the reign of David, Israel became possibly the most powerful nation on earth. David was succeeded by his son Solomon, who eventually constructed the Temple of Solomon at Jerusalem.
Okay, now we're going to get into the real meat of things, into the story of the divided kingdom.
Up to this point, we have seen how the people of Israel began with Jacob and his children, who grew in numbers, left Egypt for the Promised Land, and spent 400 years as a loose confederation of 12 tribes, and then finally becoming a kingdom. That kingdom would last just 2 generations before it divided into 2 kingdoms. If you only listen to Bible preachers, TV evangelists, and Sunday morning sermons, you might spend an entire lifetime and not ever hear about the divided kingdom, though it is essential if you wish to understand the prophets and end times prophecy. This knowledge, for whatever reason, has been hid from much of the world. Perhaps it is because biblical teachers simply don't know what to do with the fact that 10 out of the 12 tribes went missing and, as far as anyone knows, have never been found. So, how does that fit into their calculations? How does it fit into their interpretations of Bible prophecy? I believe the story of the divided kingdom simply raises too many questions that no one really has the answers to, so it's just safer to simply stick with the tribe of Judah and forget the rest. The story of the divided kingdom and the lost tribes begins with a man named Jeroboam. Jeroboam was an Ephraimite who served as the chief administrator over all labor performed by the northern tribes on behalf of King Solomon. He was also chosen as a spokesman on behalf of those tribes. During Solomon's reign, the northern tribes suffered due to forced labor practices on the part of Solomon and from heavy taxes imposed upon them from Jerusalem. These policies allowed Jerusalem to militarily and economically dominate the land of the northern tribes and control their profitable trade routes. Over time, this burden placed on the northern tribes by Solomon generated considerable resentment among the people in the north. As Solomon continued to fall into increasing idol worship, God rebuked him one day, saying, I will surely rend the kingdom from thee, and I will give it to thy servant. The servant God referred to was Jeroboam the Ephraimite. The prophet Ahijah revealed to Jeroboam that it was God's intention to make him a ruler of a new kingdom. As it worked out, when Jeroboam was leaving Jerusalem, the prophet Ahijah the Shilonite met him on the way. The prophet had clothed himself in a new garment, and as the two were alone in a field, Ahijah took hold of this new garment and tore it into 12 pieces. Then he said to Jeroboam, Take thee 10 pieces, for thus saith the Lord, the God of Israel, Behold, I will rend the kingdom out of the hand of Solomon, and will give thee 10 tribes, but he shall have 1 tribe for my servant David's sake, and for Jerusalem's sake, the city which I have chosen of all the tribes of Israel. Howbeit, I will not take the whole kingdom out of his hand, but I will make him a prince all the days of his life, for David my servant's sake, whom I chose, because he kept my commandments and my statutes in that day. But I will take the kingdom out of his son's hand, and I will give unto thee 10 tribes, and unto his son will I give 1 tribe. And I will take thee, and thou shalt reign according to all that thy soul desireth, and you shall be king over Israel. 1 Kings chapter 11, verses 32 through 37. Because of this prophecy, Solomon sought to kill Jeroboam, so Jeroboam fled to Egypt for safety. Not only does this parallel the departure of Joseph of the coat of many colors when he was sold by his brothers into Egypt as a substitute for killing him, but it also serves as a scriptural type and shadow for another Joseph, Joseph and Mary, who fled to Egypt after God warned him in a vision that he and Mary must depart. Otherwise, Jesus would have been murdered along with all the other male children under the age of 2 living under the mad reign of Herod. After the death of Solomon, Jeroboam returned and pleaded Israel's case before Solomon's son and successor, Rehoboam. When Rehoboam was coronated in Shechem in Ephraim's territory, on behalf of the elders of the 10 northern tribes, Jeroboam made an offer to the new king. He said, Thy father made our yoke grievous. Now therefore, make thou the grievous service of thy father, and his heavy yoke which he put upon us, lighter, and we will serve thee. 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 4. King Rehoboam needed a little time to consider this request to determine his response and said, Depart yet for 3 days, then come again to me. So Jeroboam and his people departed. Rehoboam then turned to the elders of his court who had counseled his father Solomon, and he asked them, How do you advise that I may answer this people? And they spake unto him, saying, If thou wilt be a servant unto this people this day, and will serve them, and answer them, and speak good words to them, then they will be thy servants forever. 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 6 and 7. They had given King Rehoboam wise advice, but instead of heeding it, Rehoboam consulted the young men he had grown up with. He asked what advice they would give, and they answered that he should tell them, Whereas my father did lay you with a heavy yoke, I will add to your yoke. My father has chastised you with whips, but I will chastise you with scorpions. 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 11. Rehoboam decided that instead of relief, he would add to their already heavy tax burden and rule with an even heavier hand than his father Solomon. His abrasive reply outraged the northern tribes, who then retracted their recognition of his rule and declared their independence. However, Rehoboam did not take them seriously, and audaciously he dispatched Adoram, chief tax collector, to collect a tribute from the northern kingdoms. Keep in mind the audacious nature of his actions, considering that he was still in Shechem and Ephraim's own territory during all of this. Adoram, the king's tax collector, was stoned to death, and Rehoboam fled in haste back to Jerusalem. Are you beginning to see a history of competitive envy and jealousy and even animosity between Ephraim in the north and Judah in the south?
The text tells us that Jews didn't have dealings with Samaritans.
Now why?
And there was a great enmity that existed between the two because the Samaritans believed that the Jews had corrupted the Torah. Jews believed that God had chosen David and his descendants to be the leaders of the people. The Samaritans thought they were the ones, and their descendants were called to be the leaders of the people, that the priesthood was meant to be the center.
Okay, so this is sounding, I'm going to stop you for a second there, because this is sounding like today.
Yeah,
I mean,
absolutely. Jews worship on Mount Moriah on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. The Samaritans said, no, it's on Mount Gerizim. That's where we're supposed to worship. They had all of these religious differences that led to this hostility that existed between them. And what I love about it is that Jesus, Yeshua, didn't allow any of this to stop him. In fact, I think he intentionally wanted to cross these racial barriers to show that God is for everyone.
Our ancestors worshipped on this mountain. But you Jews insist Jerusalem is the only place for true worship.
They say that because the temple is there.
Exactly where we're not allowed.
I'm here to break those barriers. The time is coming and is now here that it won't matter where you worship, but only that you do it in spirit and truth. Heart and mind, that is the kind of worshiper he's looking for. It won't matter where you're from or what you've done.
God allowed this division to occur for a wise purpose that only He can fully understand. But in the person of Jesus Christ, Yeshua, will those divisions be healed one day? We'll get much more in depth with regard to the woman at the well and the Samaritans in a future video. But for now, let us return to the narrative in 1 Kings to see what transpired next. Jeroboam the Ephraimite was appointed king over the northern tribes. This northern breakaway nation, with Ephraim once again in the position of leadership, along with Manasseh and 8 other tribes, were from that time forward called the Kingdom of Israel. Thus, we see the fulfillment of the patriarch Israel's words when he prophesied over his grandsons Ephraim and Manasseh, saying, "They shall be called after my name." The understanding of this fact was not in dispute. Therefore, the southern kingdom thereafter became known as the Kingdom of Judah. And that is why the book of Luke opens by saying, "There was in the days of Herod, the king of Judea, a certain priest named Zacharias." Notice it says the king of Judea, not the king of Israel. It is interesting to note that the formation of the new nation of Israel, led by Ephraim, was in part the result of a tax revolt. Likewise, another Ephraim-led nation, many years later, the United States of America, had its beginning with a tax revolt against king and country. Just as Jeroboam and the elders of Israel pled with King Rehoboam on behalf of the northern tribes for tax relief, so likewise, representatives of the New England colonies pled with the King of England for relief from their heavy tax burdens. But in both cases, the answer was even more heavy-handed tactics, which, among the colonists, culminated into all-out rebellion, beginning with the Boston Tea Party. Jeroboam the Ephraimite had a great opportunity to reign with righteousness and make Israel a nation more fully devoted to God. But his weakness got the best of him. It seemed that Jeroboam, like many of the persons we read about in the Bible, had difficulty fully trusting God in the affairs of his life. Jeroboam became apprehensive about his people's religious life, for example, which now had its center at the newly constructed temple in Jerusalem ever since the reign of David. If he'd only trusted God more, there surely would have been a solution, for God had already promised Jeroboam, saying, "If thou wilt hearken unto all that I command thee, and will walk in my ways, and do right in my sight, to keep my statutes and my commandments, I will be with thee, and build thee a sure house, as I built for David, and gave Israel unto thee." God seemed to be hinting that in time he would establish a house of worship in Shiloh. Whether or not it would have occurred, God was in control, and he knew the needs of his people. Without doubt, he could have provided for the needs of the northern tribes, but Jeroboam did not himself see a clear solution, or one that would happen fast enough for him. He may have feared what would happen if he allowed his people to travel to Jerusalem to worship, or perhaps Jeroboam's contempt for King Rehoboam was just too overwhelming. Whatever the details of his insecurity, rather than trusting and waiting upon the Lord, Jeroboam instead devised a cunning plan. He created 2 golden calves for the people to worship, strategically placing them in the northern and southern ends of the country. The one on the south was placed at Bethel, on the main road to Jerusalem. Those among the northern tribes who intended to travel to Jerusalem for God's feast could then more easily be diverted to worship at Bethel instead. Jeroboam ended up establishing other idolatrous worship practices as well. Adding to these deviations, he also appointed his own priests from other than the tribe of Levi. But perhaps the single greatest encroachment upon God's ways that Jeroboam attempted, which none had dared to do before, was to tamper with God's annual holy days. Instead of observing the Feast of Tabernacles in the 7th month, as God has commanded, Jeroboam instead instituted an alternate feast in the 8th month, in the month which he had devised in his own heart. This type of change seems reminiscent of when the Gentile Church of Rome changed the Sabbath from the 7th day of the week to the 8th day. The early Christians continued observing the 7th day of the week as a Sabbath for centuries after the crucifixion of Jesus. Modern Christians often point to the first day observance recorded in the book of Acts, also called the 8th day, or the Lord's Day, as evidence of a change in the Sabbath. While it is true that the early Christians are recorded in one place as coming together on the first day of the week to worship in celebration of the resurrection of Jesus, it is equally true that the early Christians continued to observe the 7th day as a Sabbath day of rest. The early Christians also celebrated the feast days and other traditional religious observances of Israel. Even the Apostle Paul is recorded as having observed the feasts. When the Gentiles came into the picture, they were not required by Jerusalem Council to observe many of the Jewish customs. It is not recorded whether they were encouraged to observe the feasts. But it was not until the Roman Catholic Church came into being that there was a change in the actual Sabbath from Saturday to Sunday observance. Historical records demonstrate that this was done mainly for anti-Semitic reasons, in order to distance themselves from Jewish practices. There is no place in the Scriptures that indicates the Sabbath was changed. The same church that changed the Sabbath also took up the torture and murder of Jews as a means to convert them. The Book of Mormon called this the Great and Abominable Church and claimed that it took away many plain and precious truths. The Book of Mormon speaks about the traditions of our fathers that are not according to God's ways. Is it possible that in the Gentile tradition of distancing themselves from anything Jewish, some have either made up or willingly continue to support unscriptural theories on why God would change the Sabbath day? Perhaps, like Jeroboam of old, it is something that may have been devised in our own hearts. It is also interesting to note the parallel between the Feast of Tabernacles and the Sabbath day. The Feast of Tabernacles, which Jeroboam changed from the 7th month to the 8th month, and the Sabbath, which the Gentiles changed from the 7th day to the 8th day, are both type and shadows of the millennial reign of Christ. In fact, the Feast of Tabernacles is an annual Sabbath. The days of the week were created by God in the beginning to be a type and shadow or a pattern for the millennial timeline of the earth. The 6 days of creation represent the 6,000 years man will have on earth. The 7th day is the day of rest. It is during the 7th set of 1,000 years when all of the earth will be at rest, when Satan is chained, and the kingdom of Christ and his righteousness reigns on the earth. According to the Bible, Jeroboam sinned by changing the Feast of Tabernacles from the 7th to the 8th month. It seems more than coincidental that the Church of the Dark Ages also changed the Sabbath day from the 7th day to the 1st day of the week. Too many people confuse the Sabbath with what day we go to church. The Sabbath was a day of rest. If you think about it, it doesn't matter what day we go to church. We could go every day. That has nothing to do with what day the Sabbath falls on. And the inhabitants of Zion shall also observe the Sabbath day and keep it holy. RLDS Doctrine and Covenants, 68 4D. The point here is not to start a movement to change what day we keep the Sabbath. No doubt the Lord would be well pleased if we were able to keep one day of the week as a holy rest, no matter what day it was. The Lord rewards those who diligently seek to understand and become obedient to his will. In time, the Lord can surely reveal to us what day is right when we are ready for that knowledge and when it is the right time. God did raise up Jeroboam, as he said he would, and establish the nation of Israel in the north. He even instructed Jeroboam as to how he should rule. And it shall be, if thou wilt hearken unto all that I have commanded thee, and will walk in my ways, and do right in my sight, to keep my statutes and commandments, as David my servant did in the day that I blessed him, I will be with thee, and build thee a sure house, as I built for David, and gave Israel unto thee. 1 Kings 11:38. However, Jeroboam's counterfeit religion, with its illegitimate priesthood, idols, religious festivals, and observances, was the downfall of Israel. Because of Jeroboam's transgressions, the entire nation suffered. God pronounced judgment upon Jeroboam for what he had done, saying, "Forasmuch as I exalted thee from among the people, and made thee prince over my people Israel, and rent the kingdom away from the house of David, and gave it to thee, because he kept not my commandments, but thou hast not been as my servant David, when he followed me with all of his heart, only to do right in mine eyes, but hast done evil above all that were before thee. For thou hast gone and made thee other gods and molten images to provoke me to anger, and hast cast me behind thy back. Therefore, behold, I will bring evil upon the house of Jeroboam." 1 Kings chapter 14, 7-10. And Jeroboam drove Israel from following the Lord, and made them sin a great sin. For the children of Israel walked in all the sins of Jeroboam which he did. They departed not from them, until the Lord removed Israel out of his sight, as he had said by all his servants the prophets. So was Israel carried away out of their own land to Assyria unto this day. 2 Kings chapter 17, 21-23. Like Jeroboam and the tribe of Ephraim of old, it has been easy for persons of all ages to have idols. When we love anything more than God, an idol has already entered into our hearts. The ultimate proof of our values is not in our words, but in our actions. God promised Jeroboam that if he did what God commanded, walking in his ways and doing right in God's sight, that he would be with Jeroboam, bless him, and even build him a sure house, as he built for David. There are those who would say, how could Jeroboam not comply and receive this great blessing? What was he thinking? Yet, in our own day, the same proposition was offered, but in a different form. Zion. What idols keep us from it? Zion is not yet because of our own rebellions, and the world is suffering because of it. The darkness in the world is a direct reflection of the lack of light in the church. Israel was instructed to worship the eternal God, not 2 golden calves. They were told that the Feast of Tabernacles was to be observed in the 7th month of the year, not in the 8th. None of Israel's kings restored true worship back to the God of Israel. The result of the rebellion was horrific destruction and captivity. There are lessons to be learned from the history of Israel, our ancestors, and the iniquity of King Jeroboam. The practices Jeroboam began of substituting his own days and kinds of worship for those that God had commanded continue to this day. The Gentiles have their own festivals and holidays, many of them with pagan roots, and we continue to celebrate them while relegating the holy days that God established for his people as being something Jewish. Most of us have heard that the tradition of the Christmas tree has pagan roots. Does the following description by the prophet Jeremiah sound to you like a Christmas tree? Thus saith the Lord, learn not the way of the heathen, for the custom of the people are vain, for one cutteth the tree out of the forest with the axe, they deck it with silver and gold, they fasten it with nails and its hammers that it move not. Jeremiah 10, 2-4. Does that mean we are condemned by God for having a Christmas tree, even though we aren't really aware of its pagan roots or don't think of it as such? For most of us, it is merely a tradition without any evil intent on our part. Can God cleanse a pagan practice as he cleansed all food and the Gentiles according to Peter's vision at Joppa? Anything is possible. I certainly won't judge anyone for having a Christmas tree. Each person must ask God for themselves. Even so, at the very least, we should be aware that many of our Gentile holidays have effectively replaced the celebrations that God gave us in the Scriptures, which, he said, were to be observed through all generations. They were, after all, designed to teach us about him and many prophetic events, some of which are yet to come. I don't suggest any other action than that we approach these topics prayerfully along with study and fasting so that God can reveal to us his desires regarding these things. I know God is able to make all things known to persons who really desire the truth. And as the scriptures say, if we know the truth, it will set us free. Around 722 BC, the Assyrians conquered the northern kingdom of Israel, destroyed its capital, and sent the Israelites into exile and captivity. What had been spoken by the mouth of the prophets had come to pass. A little over a century later, Judah also fell, but to the Babylonians instead of Assyria. Judah eventually returned from their captivity to build up Jerusalem again so that Christ could be born, live, and die there. But Ephraim and the other lost tribes of Israel remained dispersed among the Gentiles until this very day, with an exception. God gathered to the New World, first, a remnant of Manasseh, then the house of Ephraim with its strength. America is a land of promise, a land choice above all other lands, and the place where the new Jerusalem will come down out of heaven. However, the tribe of Ephraim has not yet fully grasped the significance of this or fulfilled its tribal calling. When this happens, it will be for the benefit of all the tribes. The Samaritans of the New Testament were so named after the capital city of exiled Ephraim. They were a small remnant of Ephraimites mixed with Gentile blood who had returned from their dispersion by Assyria. But they did have a prophecy that in the last days a restorer would come who would be a descendant of Ephraim and perform a work of restoration on behalf of Israel. The Samaritans still exist in the Holy Land, though they number only around 400 at this time. More on the Samaritans later. The Bible tells us that Assyria carried off the lost tribes to the north. It was the custom of the Assyrians that whenever they conquered a nation, they would take its citizens and scatter them throughout all the other nations whom they had previously conquered. The purpose of this was to ensure that those they conquered would not easily conspire or raise up against them again. The tribes eventually migrated further north and became known as the Lost Tribes of Israel. As the lost tribes migrated, they left traces of their passage and influenced the naming of cities, rivers, valleys, and mountains. For example, the Danes and the Danube River are likely evidences of the migrational footprint left behind by the tribe of Dan. To learn more about the numerous evidences of the tribal migrations, the book, The Lost 10 Tribes of Israel Found by Stephen M. Collins, is both interesting and helpful. The pattern of the migration of Ephraim was prophesied by the prophet Hosea when he said that Ephraim followeth after the east wind. When looking at a map of the Middle East and Europe, imagine a wind blowing out of the east, driving a people westward from the northern parts of ancient Assyria. They would continually bump up against the Mediterranean Sea, forcing them to travel in a northwesterly direction. Following this path, they would end up passing through modern-day Turkey and Greece into Europe. From there, it is believed that most of the tribe of Ephraim crossed the English Channel into what is now the British Isles. After helping to establish one of the most powerful nations there, they took the ultimate leap westward, following the east wind in their migration across the Atlantic Ocean to the New World. Aside from the migration of the tribe of Ephraim, the prophets have additionally told us that these lost tribes would eventually be scattered all over the face of the earth, even unto the isles of the sea. For lo, I will command, and I will sift the house of Israel among all nations, like as corn is sifted in a sieve, yet shall not the least grain fall upon the earth. Amos 9:9. And they who shall not be destroyed shall be scattered among all nations. But behold, thus saith the Lord God, when the day cometh that they shall believe in me, that I am Christ, then have I covenanted with their fathers, that they shall be restored in the flesh upon the earth unto the lands of their inheritance. And it shall come to pass that they shall be gathered in from their long dispersions, from the isles of the sea, and from the four parts of the earth. 2 Nephi 7. Verses 11 to 13. RLDS edition. Nevertheless, we have been driven out of the land of our inheritance, but we have been led to a better land. For the Lord has made the sea our path, and we are upon the isle of the sea. But great are the promises of the Lord unto those who are upon the isles of the sea. Wherefore, as it says isles, there must needs be more than this, and they are inhabited also by our brethren. For behold, the Lord God has led away from time to time from the house of Israel according to his will and pleasure. And now, behold, the Lord remembereth all those who have been broken off. Wherefore he remembereth us also. 2 Nephi 7:34-39, RLDS edition. Joseph Smith understood the revelation that Ephraim and the northern tribes had been intermingled among the Gentiles. He understood that Ephraim had specifically been intermingled among those Gentiles who had been led to America, and that God would establish a free nation through them. He also understood that the work which God was doing through him, including the bringing forth of the Book of Mormon, was for the express purpose of bringing about the fulfillment of God's promises to his covenant people. God has dispersed the tribes among all nations, but he knows exactly where they are, and he will gather them again in his own due time. The promise was that, lo, I will command and I will sift the house of Israel among all the nations, like as corn is sifted in a sieve. Yet shall not the least grain fall upon the earth. The cause of Zion is the gathering of the tribes and the restoration of the house of Israel. Many of the Gentiles who heard God's beckoning call to join the restoration movement, inspired by God through the prophet Joseph Smith, carry within them the DNA of the tribe of Ephraim without knowing it. The tribe needed to be reconciled to God and restored to its proper order. Most Latter-day Saints are of the tribe of Ephraim, being restored again by the power of God. But that restoration is not yet complete. It is time to awaken and come to the knowledge and understanding of our true tribal identity, and by extension, our calling. By examining the history of our own tribe, our ancestors, it is possible to see our spiritual purposes more clearly, observe our own tribal strengths and weaknesses, and hopefully avoid the tragic mistakes of the past. According to the plan and purposes of God, Joseph, son of Jacob, and his descendants were blessed with the blessing of the firstborn, and prophesied to play a leadership role among the other tribes. God's promise in 2 Nephi that, when the day cometh that they shall believe in me, that I am Christ, they shall be restored in the flesh upon the earth, unto the lands of their inheritance, and it shall come to pass that they shall be gathered in from their long dispersion from the isles of the sea and the four parts of the earth. Ephraim learned of Christ through the Church of Rome, but during the time when the church was corrupted and had become the great and abominable church. However, England eventually turned against the Church of Rome and embraced the Reformation, which began a long process of reformations which would eventually lead pilgrims to colonize the New World in search of religious freedom, setting the stage for the restoration of all things to begin. The tribe of Ephraim was led here after the tribe of Manasseh. Howbeit, Manasseh was likewise born first, and Ephraim second. But when the two awakened to a sense of their spiritual identity, destiny, and purpose, then the tribe of Joseph is made whole again, and these two tribes can prepare the way for the other lost tribes, which, as we shall see, have already been gathering here for the last 200 years, and continue to gather even now, but mainly as a physical gathering, not so much a spiritual. It is part of our destinies, Ephraim, along with our brother Manasseh, once he awakens, to prepare the way that the other tribes not only gather here from the four corners of the earth physically, but that they awaken spiritually to their tribal identity in Israel and cling with all their might to the Lamb of God to serve him and bring about Zion.